Summer in New Haven always seemed exhausting, but for Douglas Warren, it was the perfect season to make a lifelong dream come true. He spent most of his life in his father's garage, fixing other people's cars and saving money. His savings were only enough to live on modestly, but Douglas had a secret. In a small shed behind the house, he spent years assembling his own car. The model he had dreamed of since childhood, a 1967 sports convertible. He looked for all the parts in junkyards, abandoned garages and garage sales, and spent all his free time breathing life into the car. And now, after 10 years of painstaking work, the car was ready. A shiny red convertible with chrome details stood in the sun, and Douglas couldn't take his eyes off it. This wasn't just a car, it was freedom. All that was left to do was start the engine and hit the road. But where to? Douglas thought about it while looking at the road map. He chose the California coast. The ocean seemed magical to a man who had never left his state in his life. In the morning, having thrown several old suitcases, a sleeping bag, and tools in case of breakdowns into the trunk, Douglas started the engine. The engine rumbled like a wild animal, and his heart skipped a beat. It seemed to him that now everything was possible. The first days of the journey were exciting. He drove along country roads, stopped at small roadside cafes, and spent the night under the open sky. The people he met along the way seemed kind and responsive. The owner of one diner, having seen a rare convertible model, even invited Douglas to dinner at his own expense, and a couple of travelers from Texas gave him a map with the best views on the highway. Everything was going perfectly until the third day, when the car stalled in the middle of a deserted road. Douglas was not a man to be afraid of breakdowns. He opened the hood, wiped his face with an oily rag, and got to work. He quickly found the cause. Something was wrong with the fuel supply. All that was left was to fix it, but that would require a part that he could not make from scrap materials. The nearest town was at least 40 miles away. There was no cell phone reception, and this baffled him. The sun was setting, and the desert, which seemed beautiful during the day, was alarming at night. Douglas decided to stay near the car and go on foot for help in the morning. He laid out a sleeping bag right on the back seat of the convertible and lay down, looking at the stars. When morning came, he packed up and set off on foot. He walked for several hours until he saw an approaching truck. The driver, an elderly man with a thick beard, stopped and listened to Douglas's story. The man nodded, offering to give him a ride to the nearest town. Douglas thanked him and got into the cab. Along the way, the old man told him about himself. His name was Tom Harding, and he was a long-haul truck driver who had spent his entire life traveling around the country. He saw something familiar in Douglas and began sharing his stories about how, when he was young, he too had dreamed of hitting the road to see the ocean. But life had turned out differently, and instead of adventure, he had chosen a stable job. When they arrived in town, Tom left Douglas at an auto parts store. Finding the right part was a matter of minutes, but then a new problem arose. Douglas had almost no money left. He barely had enough for the return trip to New Haven, but he was not going to go back. For a moment, Douglas wondered. Maybe this was all a mistake? Maybe he really had dreamed too much? However, it was at this moment that Tom pulled up to the store again. Smiling, he handed Douglas a few bills and said that he had to help a man who was living his dream. Douglas wanted to refuse at first, but then took the money, promising to return it as soon as he got to the ocean. On the way back to the car, Tom helped Douglas install the part and start the convertible. The engine rumbled again, as if it had never broken down. Douglas thanked the old man and then set off again. However, a few miles before the end of the day, he noticed that the road suddenly changed. Instead of a wide highway, he found himself on a narrow dirt road that led deep into the forest. The map did not show this route, but Douglas had no desire to turn around. The trees were growing taller and denser, and the sunlight almost disappeared, breaking through the crown in thin rays. Douglas felt small in this majestic forest, but he was overcome by a strange feeling, as if he was driving not just on a road, but on some other world that lived its own life. When he finally drove into a small clearing, his attention was drawn to an old house. It stood alone, surrounded by thick trees, with a collapsed roof and cracked walls. The place looked abandoned, but for some reason the convertible slowed down on its own, as if even the car sensed that something important was here. Douglas turned off the engine and looked for a long time at the house that stood in front of him. The place looked as if it had been abandoned decades ago. There was not a single sound around, except for the rustling of the wind in the crowns of the trees. He did not want to linger here longer than necessary, but twilight was already thickening on the horizon, and the nearest settlement was far away. He decided to inspect the house to find a suitable place to spend the night. The clearing, surrounded by thick trees, seemed too open and vulnerable. Douglas took a flashlight from the car and stepped to the front door, which was slanted and half open. His boots creaked on the old, dusty boards of the porch. It was cold and quiet inside. The house looked as if time had stopped the moment the last person left this place. A table with one broken leg, chairs that had fallen apart, a broken kerosene lamp on the floor. There were stains on the walls that could have been from water or soot. Shards of glass and pieces of wood crunched underfoot. Douglas walked deeper, shining the flashlight into each room. In one of them, he found an old sofa, covered in dust and a holey blanket. It was not the most comfortable place, but better than spending the night in the open. He returned to the car, took a sleeping bag, a couple of sandwiches and a canister of water, and settled down on the sofa. The night turned out to be long. The wind outside was picking up, and the old house was creaking like an old ship on the open sea. Douglas thought the sounds were coming from all directions, but he tried to ignore them. He remembered Tom saying that the road sometimes brought surprises. Perhaps this house was one of those surprises. At dawn, he woke up to the sun shining through the cracked windows. The house seemed less scary in the daylight, but now Douglas noticed something he hadn't seen at night. On one of the walls, someone had carved the words, "Don't stop," with a knife. The phrase sounded strange, but he decided not to pay attention to it. Maybe it was just a stupid joke from those who had been here before him. However, when Douglas returned to the car to continue on his way, he discovered that one of the back tires was flat. He sighed and took the spare tire out of the trunk. There was absolute silence around him while he worked. This was not a place where he wanted to linger for long. After changing the tire, he got behind the wheel and turned the key in the ignition. The engine started without a problem, and Douglas felt relieved when he left the clearing and drove out onto the road again. The forest seemed endless. Douglas drove for more than an hour, but there were still more trees. At one point, it seemed to him that he was circling the same route, although the road looked straight. When he finally saw a sign indicating the highway, a feeling of relief came over him. On the highway, everything became easier again. The road was wide. There were other cars, and he again felt part of the familiar world. He made a stop at the nearest gas station for a snack and to fill up the tank. There was a small shop with road maps and souvenirs. Among the goods on the counter, his attention was drawn to a photograph. It depicted the very house where he spent the night. The old woman behind the cash register, noticing his interest, said that this place had long been abandoned. According to her, the house was built in the early 1900s for a family of farmers, but they left it when large companies began to buy up local lands for logging. Only the house remained, a reminder of another era. Douglas thanked her for the information, but he felt uncomfortable holding the photograph in his hands. The rest of the journey was calm. Over the course of a few days, he crossed state after state, stopped at several picturesque places recommended by Tom, and even earned a little money helping random people with car repairs. He loved this life on the road. He felt a freedom he had never experienced before. However, the strange things continued. One day, waking up at dawn near a small lake, he discovered that there were tracks in the sand near the convertible. Someone or something had approached the car while he was sleeping. The tracks were not human. They resembled hoof prints, but there were no animals nearby. A couple of days later, while driving along the coast, the convertible suddenly stopped on its own. The engine had stalled, although there was plenty of gas. He got out to inspect the car and noticed that there was a branch lying in the road that he had not seen before. It was broken, and its parts resembled an arrow pointing to a path leading away from the road to the hill. Douglas did not understand why, but he followed this impulse. He left the car by the side of the road and walked along the trail. A few minutes later, he found himself on top of a hill with a stunning view of the ocean. It was the first time he had seen it. The sea stretched to the horizon, and the waves sparkled in the rays of the setting sun. Douglas felt his heart fill with joy. Everything he had started this journey for was worth these long days. He stayed on the hill until dark, enjoying the view and the sense of accomplishment. When he returned to the convertible, it was as if the car had been changed. The engine started right away, and it drove like a new one. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the road had something else in store for him ahead. The wind from the ocean, fresh and invigorating, seemed like a real gift to Douglas. The feeling that he had finally reached his destination was inspiring. But deep down there was a strange anxiety, as if the journey was not over yet. It became stronger when he turned onto an old coastal road that went along cliffs and beaches. Douglas drove slowly, enjoying the views. The ocean sometimes disappeared behind the cliffs, then again revealed itself in all its might. He decided that before sunset he would stop at one of the secluded beaches that sometimes flashed along the route. However, when he noticed another sign with the inscription, Elk Cove Beach, 2 miles, his heart suddenly began to beat faster. The two words sounded familiar to him, although he was sure he had never heard of such a place. The road leading to Elk Cove was narrow and wound along high cliffs. At each sharp turn, Douglas gripped the steering wheel tighter, afraid that the tires would not hold the pressure. But his convertible, as if sensing the mood of its owner, handled the road perfectly. When he finally saw the beach, his breath caught in his throat. The place looked like a postcard. Golden sand surrounded by high cliffs with waves crashing against it. In the distance, a lone lighthouse could be seen, which had long since stopped working. Douglas turned off the engine, got out of the car and breathed in the salty air. He spent the entire day at the beach, sitting peacefully on the sand, feeling the tension that had built up over the years melt away. But towards evening, something unusual caught his attention. Just under the cliffs, where the waves rolled onto the sand, something was shining. As he approached, he found a metal chest half buried in the wet sand. He picked up an old board that was lying nearby and began to dig it out. The board sank easily into the damp sand, and in a few minutes the chest was free. It seemed solid, with thick metal corners, and although time had left its marks on it, the lock still held. Douglas pulled the handle, but the lid did not even budge. He searched the chest for a weak spot and noticed that the hinges were already badly rusted. Taking a small crowbar from the trunk of the convertible, which he always kept in case of need, he inserted it between the lid and the body. With a slight click, the lock gave way. When he opened the chest, his eyes widened in surprise. Inside were rolled up old maps, some documents, and under them something metal, wrapped in oiled cloth. His heart began to pound as he began to unwrap the find. Under the cloth was an old compass that looked like a real work of art. The needle, despite its age, moved slowly, as if the mechanism was still working. But his finds did not end there. Among the documents were clippings from old newspapers, dated back to the end of the 19th century. All the articles were about a captain named Edward Reed and his mysterious disappearance while searching for a sunken ship. The ship, according to rumors, was carrying gold intended for transportation from South America to California, but was lost in a storm. Douglas thoughtfully studied the contents of the chest. The maps, as he realized, pointed not to the sea, but to land. On one of them, a black line marked the route that ended in the mountains, not far from the coast. Carefully examining the map, he realized that one of the roads marked on it resembled the very serpentine he had just descended. Douglas was far from an adventurer, but something told him that this was not just an accident. He decided to keep all the things he found and sort them out later. But first, he needed to get back to the highway before it got dark. The way back turned out to be more difficult than he expected. The road, which seemed simple during the day, turned into an obstacle course at night. The moonlight barely made it through the clouds, and the winding turns required extreme concentration. And yet, having reached the highway, Douglas felt relieved. He decided to stop in the nearest town to spend the night and think about everything that had happened. The town he came across was called St. James. It was a tiny settlement with a couple of motels, a gas station, and a single bar. He rented a room in a motel, had a quick bite to eat, and returned to the things he had found. The compass he had taken from the trunk suddenly began to act strangely. The needle moved, pointing not north as it should have, but southeast. Before he could think about it properly, he noticed someone approaching his car. From the window of the motel room, he saw a man in dark clothes carefully walking around the convertible, as if he were looking for something. Douglas hid, watching him. The man paused at the trunk, then, looking around, quickly disappeared into the shadows of the street. The next morning, while inspecting the convertible, Douglas noticed that the lock on the trunk was slightly damaged, as if someone had tried to open it. Everything inside was still in place, but this incident alerted him. Who could know about his finds? And why was someone else interested in them? Douglas decided to act. He did not have a clear plan, but one thing was clear. He could not stop. The compass, the maps, and the road itself were leading him forward to something more than just a chance discovery. Douglas set out on the road early in the morning. The car, despite its oddities, worked perfectly. He was determined to find out where the compass was leading him and what was hidden behind this ancient chest. The map he had found among his other things now lay on the seat next to him, as if reminding him of the riddle he had unwittingly begun to solve. The road led him back to the coast, and then turned inland. The compass continued to point southeast, without deviating even a degree. From time to time he stopped, checked the map, and noted how the route became more and more difficult. Narrow dirt roads gave way to highways, until finally he found himself at the foot of low, but densely forested mountains. Douglas parked the car in a small area near the path that led up. Here began the path that, according to the map, should lead to the end point of the route. Taking with him a compass, a map, a lantern, and some water, he left the convertible and went on foot. The path was winding and in places almost invisible. It twisted through dense thickets and led ever higher. The air became cooler, and there was a tense silence all around, broken only by his steps and the occasional cry of birds. Douglas checked the compass several times, but the arrow always pointed forward. After an hour of walking, the path led him to a small rocky area. Here he noticed a strange structure, stone slabs installed in the shape of a circle. On their surface were carved symbols that he could not decipher. In the center of the circle lay a massive stone, almost completely covered in moss. Douglas came closer and began to examine the slabs. The compass in his hand suddenly began to behave strangely. The arrow began to spin, as if it had lost its direction. He felt that he was close to something important. As he walked around the stone in the center of the circle, his attention was drawn to a crack in the ground. At first glance, it was an ordinary crevice, but upon closer inspection, he realized that it was an entrance, a low, narrow tunnel leading deeper. His heart began to beat faster, but fear was replaced by curiosity. Douglas turned on the flashlight and carefully crawled into the tunnel. It smelled damp inside, and the air was heavy. The walls of the tunnel, lined with stone, seemed artificial. After a few minutes of descent, he found himself in a small room where the walls were covered with ancient drawings and inscriptions. In the center of the room was a wooden box that looked as if it had been placed there quite recently. He approached it, illuminating it with the flashlight, and opened the lid. Inside were gold coins, ancient jewelry, and another small metal object resembling a medallion. On its surface was engraved the same symbol as on the slabs outside. But that was not all. Among the coins lay a note, written in a clumsy handwriting. It read, "You have not come here by chance. This legacy seeks those who are ready to take responsibility. Use it wisely." Douglas froze, holding the note in one hand and the medallion in the other. All this time he had thought that this was just an abandoned chest old maps, and a coincidence. But now it all added up to something more. Having collected the coins and the medallion, he climbed out of the tunnel. On the surface, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in crimson and gold hues. He turned to look again at the stone slabs. Now they seemed not mysterious, but complete, as if something had found its place. Douglas returned to the convertible with a feeling that his life had changed. He did not know what to do with the find, but he was sure that the compass had led him here for a reason. He got behind the wheel and headed back to the highway. He drove for several days, stopping only at night. He was trying to find a place where he could leave his finds so he could come back to them later. And when he saw a sign for a small town with a local history museum, he knew that this was it. Douglas handed the coins and maps over to the museum director, keeping only the medallion and the compass. He told his story, but left out the details about the note and the tunnel, deciding that it should remain his secret. The next day, he hit the road again. But now his journey took on a new meaning. He realized that the road is not just a route from point A to point B. It is an opportunity to find yourself, to discover something new, and to become a part of something bigger. When the ocean appeared on the horizon again, Douglas smiled. His journey was not over yet, but now he was ready for any surprises that the road had in store for him.